Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to be here. I always love coming to this place. I'm not going to answer the question. I think it's probably self-evident that I think it's not too bad, actually, radioactivity, because it's what I do. My job, I work here at St Thomas's Hospital, which I'm a research chemist, academic, and my title is Professor of Imaging Chemistry, which means that I do chemistry that supports medical imaging. And the nice thing that we have the privilege to have our labs, which is a scientific chemistry and biology lab at St Thomas's Hospital, embedded in the campus, surrounded by medics, surrounded by medical departments and patients. So we're in very close contact with the people who use the chemistry that we develop. So that integration of a science lab, which is part of King's College London, with the hospital is key to some of the things that we develop. So this is all about nuclear medicine. It's using radioisotopes in medicine. And what we do, or what the clinicians do, and I provide them with materials and invent new tracers for them to do this, is inject a radioactive compound into a patient, usually intravenously. And we do this on purpose for the good of the patient. So you can guess that we probably do think it's good for them. And this happens, it's a very routine thing, thousands of times every day, right across the UK and of course around the world. And the radioactive molecules that we inject are carried around the body in the blood, delivered to all the cells in the body, and some of them bind to specific targets in the body which they recognize and stick to, and the rest can diffuse back out of the cells back into the blood and then get excreted through the kidneys or through the liver. So the background of unbound radioactivity, unbound molecules, is cleared away, leaving radioactivity left behind to get a map like this. So in some places the radioactivity remains. This is a patient with a tumour called medullary thyroid cancer. This is a patient who probably hasn't got cancer by the looks of the scan, but you see the bright areas, or the dark areas here, the yellow areas here, represent the places where the radioactivity has stuck. So we can image this, we can map the radioactivity with a scanner, and I'll show you one in a minute, or we can use that radioactivity, we can exploit the toxic properties of the radioactivity to deliver a toxic radiation dose specifically to the tumour, and whilst preserving the surrounding tissue relatively untouched. So we can inject loads of different kinds of molecules labelled with this radioactivity for different purposes, to diagnose different types of diseases or to measure the distribution of different kinds of drugs in the body. So what I will do is tell you about the imaging part, where we're using radionuclides to map chemical processes in the body. My colleague Sam, who I'll introduce at the end of my section, will talk about using radioactivity to kill cells, which is predominantly for use in treating cancer. So why do we have to use radioactivity to perform this function? Well, the key reason is that, unlike visible light, gamma rays can penetrate into the body. You can see deep into the body with gamma rays. It's like X-rays. In fact, they're the same as X-rays. The only difference between X-rays and gamma rays is that gamma rays originate from the nucleus of the atom, and X-rays come from other sources. Another reason is that it's fantastically sensitive. We can inject a very tiny amount of chemical, very tiny amount of the radioactive drug. It might be a lot of radioactivity, but chemically it's a very small quantity, and that means that it doesn't interfere with the chemistry that's going on in the body. It doesn't change the chemical processes that you're investigating. Absolutely tiny amounts, picomolar. It's really a true tracer concept, and doesn't disturb the molecular processes that are going on, and it's not really a risk of toxicity. Other kinds of imaging, magnetic resonance imaging for instance, or X-ray CT imaging, can be used with contrast agents, but there the contrast agents have to be used in much greater quantities, and they can be toxic and they can interfere with the processes that they're imaging. So this leads to the idea that that molecular imaging is possible. We're imaging molecular processes. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. So this idea of using radioactivity has its disadvantages. Of course, people get a radiation dose, and there's some toxicity associated with it. That's bad. It can be very expensive. The isotopes, the radioisotopes, are expensive. The scanners are expensive. And another problem with radioactivity, which we would dearly love to get around, but there is no solution to that I can ever possibly imagine, is that you cannot switch radioactivity on and off. It just slowly decays away at its own rate, and you can't speed it up, you can't heat it, you can't shine light on it. Nothing changes the rate at which the radioactivity is emitted. All we can do is see from our scans where it is. But that's very useful in itself. We take advantage of different kinds of radioisotopes. So the main ones that you may well have been introduced to in your science education is alpha particles, which are heavy, particulate, positively charged form of radiation, which has very low penetration. It doesn't really penetrate your skin. So that's useless for imaging because you can't see inside the body with it. Beta particles, these are just electrons which are traveling very fast, and they can penetrate tissue to a depth of between a fraction of a millimeter and about a centimeter. So again, for imaging inside the body, not very useful. But gamma rays can penetrate straight through tissue, straight through perspex here, and they end up being stopped only by a decent thickness of lead. So radioactivity inside your body can pass outside the body and be detected by a scanner. We also have positron emitters, so we've got gamma emitters which can be used for imaging, but we have another form of radioactivity called positron emitters, and these, a positron is a little bit of antimatter. It's the antimatter form of the electron, and a bit of antimatter, when it encounters a bit of matter, will annihilate itself. The mass of the electron and the positron will disappear and be converted into energy, and the energy is emitted in the form of more gamma rays, so we can image those. So this is the basis of positron emission tomography. This is what happens here is we have an atomic nucleus which probably has a few too many protons to be stable. And one of those protons will spontaneously convert into a neutron, and the charge is conserved, it's lost from the nucleus, but it's emitted in the form of a positron. It's this little bit of antimatter. There's a neutrino emitted at the same time, but we'll ignore that because we can't detect it. And sooner or later, that bit of antimatter encounters an electron, usually within the space of a millimeter or so. It travels out away from the nucleus, and when it loses sufficient energy to interact with the surrounding electrons, it will pair up with an electron. They will annihilate each other and disappear in a puff of gamma rays. And the two gamma rays that are emitted at 180 degrees to each other. So when they're detected, and this is a sort of a cross-section of the scanner with a person inside there, when they're detected by two of these crystals, we know that somewhere along that line that joins the two crystals, that positron was annihilated. So it's roughly telling us where the radioactivity was. So just to summarize that in this little picture, this is an actual gamma camera image. In fact, this is the first gamma camera image of the first new tracer that I developed back in about 1990. The patient has medullary thyroid carcinoma, but I'm just using it here to illustrate the principle that if we do imaging by shining X-rays in one side of the patient and measure what comes out in the other, we can image anatomy. We can see different organs, the shapes of the organs by virtue of their different density. But in what we do, we're injecting radioisotopes and waiting for them to localize in this case a tumor. And if we're lucky and it decays at the right time, it emits a gamma ray, and we can detect that gamma ray outside the body and know where it came from. If we do that with a positron emitter, we see two gamma rays, and we can detect those outside the body and know where they came from. And if we use an alpha particle or a beta particle, these do not penetrate. Their energy is absorbed very quickly in a space of a few micrometers or a few millimeters. So we can't detect them, but all that energy is focused into a very small space. And so that's very, very toxic. It can kill cells, and because we know it's targeted from this imaging, we can know that the tumor tissue is receiving a high radiation dose, but all the surrounding normal tissues are relatively protected. And of course, we need a scanner as well. So we can have a gamma camera to detect gamma rays. We can have a PET scanner, and these nowadays are coupled to a CT scanner, so we do a PET and an X-ray at the same time, so we can see the molecular picture superimposed on anatomical image, which helps the medics who interpret the images to have a better sort of geographical understanding of where things are going on. And the most up-to-date type of scanner, and there are now a couple of these in the UK, one of which is at King's and the other one is at UCL down the road, is combining with positron emission tomography with magnetic resonance imaging. So combining those two into one scanner to get the benefit of both kinds of imaging. And I've shown you this before. This is the kind of image you get, a rather fuzzy, low-resolution image, but it's telling you where the radioactivity is. So in this case, the radioactivity, you can see it's located in the heart, a little bit, and this is the bone marrow in the spine. You can see a little bit has been excreted into the bladder. And if I had been a bit more careful and chosen an image that had the brain in it, you would see the brain was really lit up, because the brain relies on glucose, which is the molecule that's been injected here in radioactive form. The brain relies exclusively on glucose for all its energy, so the brain takes up a huge amount of this tracer. So what are we measuring with radionuclides? What is molecular imaging? So what we're measuring is how much of the radio tracer binds to different tissues. So it's measuring the concentration in tissue of whatever the molecule is that is binding the tracer. But of course, the radioactivity is being delivered to that tissue by the blood. So it's also measuring how much blood is going to that tissue, and we have to disentangle those two quantities. We can do this in a time-dependent manner. So we can take snapshots, we can even assemble snapshots into videos. So what we're seeing is chemical changes inside the body that other types of imaging can't see. There's no structural change. We might be seeing a disease process, which is a change in the expression of a gene, or a change in the pH of the tissue, or a change in the level of oxygen in the tissue, which you can't see in the form of a structural change, but you can see it in a chemical change. So this again is molecular imaging. Whereas other types of imaging can see anatomical changes, like X-rays being able to see the skeleton, for example. With magnetic resonance imaging, we're measuring the amount of water. With ultrasound, we're measuring elasticity and so on. So this is the only way that you get really good molecular imaging. So this is, the scan I just showed you is actually a scan performed with radioactive glucose. Instead of one of the hydroxyl groups in the glucose molecule, we have a fluorine, and the fluorine is radioactive. That is sufficiently similar to normal glucose that it will be taken into cells by a transporter on the surface of the cell whose job is to bring glucose into the cell to be used as fuel. So what we're imaging in this picture is actually the activity of that transporter. And you can see there's a lot of it going on in the heart. So it's seeing the activity of the transporter which takes glucose into the cell. Once in the cell, that glucose is modified as part of the normal metabolism of the cell to trap the glucose in the cell. So this process is an enzyme-based process. We're imaging that as well. And again, we have to disentangle the contribution of those two processes. So I mentioned that we can do this dynamically, and this is an example of a video showing the injection of a radioisotope, which starts now, and you see it being circulated around the body. The whole body is radioactive, and then at one point we inject another compound which clears the radioactivity from the blood and gets it all into the bladder. So you can see this process dynamically over a period of a few minutes. And then here's another one which is also a type of dynamic imaging, but it takes place over several days. So this is a radio-labeled antibody, big molecule which diffuses rather slowly into tissue and clears very slowly from the blood. So in the early stages, what you see is radioactivity in the blood, in the main blood vessels in the heart. So we've got the heart there, the main vessels leading up to the brain, and the aorta down to the abdomen. And gradually this clears over time. 72 hours, most of it's gone, and we see radioactivity just where it's meant to be in the tumour. But some of these processes take a long time, and we have to be patient and wait for this for the clearance of the background. So for this, we need to use a long half-life tracer that decays rather slowly. What do we use it all for? Well, the whole point is clinical diagnosis, to enable the clinician to make decisions about how to treat the patient. And it applies to just about any kind of disease you can think of. Cancer, heart disease, dementia is getting more reliant on molecular imaging, kidney disease, transplants and rejection of transplants, detecting infection, finding out where these things are. You may be registering a temperature and there is a site within the body which is infected and you don't know where it is. You can find it by imaging. So we can localize the site of disease. We can find out things about the chemistry happening in the disease by whether or not it takes up a particular tracer. And we can use this for predicting whether a particular therapy will work, whether a tumor will respond to a particular drug. We can use it to measure whether the tumor has responded to a particular drug. So if we can get a very quick readout of whether the drug is working from imaging, then we can find out that it's not working, and then we can change the drug regime very quickly. And of course, it's a useful tool in research and development for drug development and basic studies of the biology happening inside you. And of course, the whole thing is non-invasive. You don't have to cut the person open. You can image the whole thing from the outside of the body. The kinds of processes that you can image, we've shown you glucose metabolism, which is prevalent everywhere. This is applicable to almost any disease you can think of because so many tissues rely on glucose for their fuel. But amino acid metabolism, protein receptors, we can image how fast cells are dividing and growing. We can measure the action of drugs. We can see if a tissue is short of oxygen by molecular imaging. We can image cells that are dying. We can image processes like blood vessel growth. So if you've got wound healing, you'll have new blood vessels growing. And in recent years, neurodegeneration, and particularly Alzheimer's disease, has become a subject of molecular imaging. And probably quite importantly over the next few years, as cell therapies become important, so we're using things like stem cells and transplanted liver cells, placed in a patient's body, we need to know where those cells go when they're injected into the body. So we can radio-label the cells and watch where they go with a scanner. And that's just a kind of a snapshot of applications. You can think of any disease condition, you can think of a use for imaging. This concept of molecular imaging, this is quite a recent word. I mean, I've been in this field of research for getting on for 30 years, and when I first started, nobody had ever used the word molecular imaging. What we considered to be, what we thought we were doing is illustrated with these couple of examples. This is an image of a patient's thyroid, 2 lobes of the thyroid at the base of the neck here, done with radioactive iodine. And radioactive iodine is taken up by the thyroid because it is used to synthesize thyroid hormones. So we see hot spots at the base of the neck where the thyroid glands are. In this case, you can see a nice butterfly-shaped gland, but there's a little defect in this area, just on the left side there, which is telling us that there is some tissue that is not functioning as normal thyroid. It's probably a tumor. Later on, after the diseased thyroid has been removed, unfortunately, this patient has that cancer has spread, and there's lots of locations all over the body where the radioiodine is being taken up. But we would have described that in those days as imaging thyroid function because we didn't really know much about what the function was. So pre-1990s, and this is about the time that I started in the game, we would have called this functional imaging. But then over the succeeding years, people began to learn what it is that makes iodine get taken up in the thyroid. And again, like I mentioned, the glucose transporter in the heart and in other cells, the thyroid has a transporter which grabs the iodide ion and brings it into the cell to help it make thyroid hormone. So what we then know that we're imaging is the function of that particular transporter. So instead of imaging a function, which is a kind of a rather vaguely defined, we're imaging the activity of a specific known protein, which is obviously telling us more useful and specific information. So the evolution of functional imaging to molecular imaging parallels knowing more about the mechanism of the process that we're imaging. So it's the same image and the same process, but we give it a different name because we know the mechanism. During that period as well, the types of tracers that we use has evolved. So back in the 60s and 70s, tracers were developed in a kind of a serendipitous way. We got these radioactive isotopes. We think, well, what can we do with them? We can find a way of incorporating them into some molecules that are relatively easy to make without any particular purpose in mind, see what they do, inject it into a rat and image it and see what it looks like, and you end up with tracers accidentally developed that were useful for imaging liver function or kidney function or blood flow in the heart. During the 80s and 90s, and this is when I began to get involved, we've started to get better at designing things, but still quite simple chemistry. And in the last 20 years or so, with much exploding knowledge of molecular biology and the mechanisms of disease, we're beginning to use really designer tracers, often actual proteins or peptides that are part of the disease process produced by the body. We can radiolabel these and use them as radio tracers. So the whole design of radio tracers is improving. So this is an example of a typical tracer that would be developed in the last few years based on a protein. So here is a schematic showing we've got, this is the target molecule. This is a protein that will be sitting on the membrane of a tumour cell, for example. And we know that another protein in the body will bind to this protein. And so if we can radiolabel this protein by putting a radioisotope on it, this is an isotope called indium-111, and it's bound to the protein with a linker molecule. This is where the chemistry comes in. We can then inject that whole protein radionuclide conjugate, and it will find its way to the tumour and bind to this target. So the modern tracer consists of a targeting component, or we call the vehicle, which carries it to the target and binds it, and it carries a radionuclide which gives you the signal which is detected by the camera. Sometimes these functions are combined into one. So here we can distinguish between the protein and the probe, the radiolabel, but sometimes it's the same thing, as in the iodide example. The iodine itself is the radioisotope, and there's nothing more complicated than that. Choosing a radionuclide, and the emphasis is on choosing. We cannot design a radionuclide. A radionuclide has fixed properties. There's nothing we can do to make it decay faster or change what kind of particles it emits. We have to choose one for a purpose. So the purpose might be positron emission tomography, or it might be gamma camera imaging. We might be choosing it for therapy. We need to know how fast the biological process is so that we can match the rate of decay of the tracer, of the radionuclide, to that process. If it's a slow process, we need a long half-life, slowly decaying radionuclide. And we also need to match the chemistry of the radionuclide to the kind of molecule that we want to build it into. And that's so the choice not only depends on the kinds of emissions, but it depends on the chemical properties of the particular isotope. We can design this vehicle to bind better or worse to a particular target, but we can't design the radionuclide. All we can do is choose what's available. Each radioisotope has fixed radiological properties of emission type or half-life, varying from seconds to days. And it has its own chemical element properties. So we choose, to get the properties that we want, we have to go all over the periodic table. And this is the joy of it for me as a chemist, because I get to play across the whole periodic table with different elements, and it's really interesting and fun and varied. So this is what I often give talks about, called the nuclear chocolate box, because you're taking what you choose from a palette of what's available. So for example, this is technetium right in the middle of the periodic table. A huge amount of nuclear medicine is based on the element technetium. And we've got copper here, which has some radioisotopes which we can use for imaging a number of different processes. And gallium, which, as far as your body is concerned, your body thinks gallium is iron, and it handles it as if it's iron. And in this case, this is a patient with lymphoma, and the lymphoma is taking up iron, and because we give it gallium, it will take up the gallium as well. And we can see the tumour lighting up on the gamma camera image. That's the fluorine-labeled glucose that I showed you. This is the iodine tracer that I showed you. This is an yttrium-90 therapy of neuroendocrine tumours. Radium, which Sam will tell you a bit more about in a minute. Radium is an alpha emitter, and radium has connotations right from the very beginnings of radioactivity research. Rhenium, which is very like technetium, but is used for therapy. And This is a fairly new one, new kid on the block, zirconium-89, which in this case is being used for the application I mentioned earlier on for tracking cells. You can inject cells into the body and see where they go. And that's a cheat because that's boron, but it's not radioactive boron. The actual radioactivity there is fluorine. That's just because it's a neat piece of inorganic chemistry, but it's not really the concern today. So we get to do chemistry right across the periodic table because we need a range of different radioisotope properties. Where do they come from, these radioisotopes? Well, we have to make them. They're all fairly short half-life, so if they were, you could dig them out of the ground, they would have decayed away long ago, and any useful radioactivity has to be manufactured. And we manufacture it in various ways using very high accelerating charged particles like protons to really high energy, crashing them into a target nucleus, and that causes the nucleus of the atom in the target to either accept the proton or emit a particle and change into another nucleus. And that nucleus is our radionuclide that we want to use. Nowadays we don't use a linear path accelerator like this one. We use a cyclic path in a cyclotron, and we now have cyclotrons in some hospitals to produce the radioisotopes that we need. A lot of isotopes are produced in nuclear reactors. Hospitals don't have these. There are a few of them dotted around the world, and we have to transport the radioisotope from the nuclear reactor to the hospital. And then there's this marvelous and really simple, wonderful invention that made nuclear medicine possible, the generator. And this is just a little device that I could hold in my hand if I could carry the weight of the lead shielding around it, and solves a big problem. Most hospitals have one of these in order to make the radio tracers that they need for their day-to-day scanning. And of course, those hospitals that have a cyclotron nearly always seems to be in the basement because it's surrounded by tons and tons of lead and concrete because it's very radioactive. So the people that actually operate the cyclotrons, these guys rarely see the light of day. And you can see that it's a round device, and it's round because it accelerates the particles not in a straight line but in a circle. So it's whizzing the particles round and round, getting faster and faster until they can escape from that circular path and smash into the target. And if you don't like the physics part of it, that's the explanation of how it works for the biologists. And thanks to Gary Larson for both of those two cartoons. The history of nuclear medicine, it's very routine now, but it hasn't always been routine. Began a long time ago in the 1930s with the invention of the first cyclotrons and nuclear reactors. So in the late 1930s, the first administration of synthetic radioisotopes to patients was made in California. 32 phosphorus was given to patients with hematological disease. Iodine-131 was experimented with in patients with thyroid disease. To not much avail in those days, but you have to learn, when you have a new tool, you have to learn how to use it. Of course, we needed the scanners. They didn't really come along until the 1960s. The gamma camera was invented in the early 60s, and the PET scanner wasn't far behind in the 1970s. The nice piece of chemistry that made it all possible was the technetium-99m generator. This is a little device just so big, which enables you to have technetium-99m in your hospital every day. Developed in Brookhaven National Laboratory in the States in 1961. And probably the most recent big development is the invention of fluorodeoxyglucose, that glucose tracer that I showed you earlier on. This came about in 1976, and it began to become into routine clinical use in the 1990s. And it was this that drove the conversion from gamma camera imaging to PET scanning, because it could only be done. You couldn't radiolabel glucose with any gamma emitters. There aren't any with the right kind of chemistry, so you can only label it with fluorine-18, which is a positron emitter. But this fluorodeoxyglucose was important in so many diseases, so many patients could benefit from it, that it was worth the huge investment to build cyclotrons in hospitals and put in PET scanners. And of course then, when you have your PET scanners and cyclotrons, there's lots more things you can do with them apart from make radioactive glucose. So that spawned a whole new field of medical imaging. I just want to say a little more about the technetium generator, because it's such a wonderfully simple invention. Technetium-99 has, over the years, been used for the vast majority of scans in nuclear medicine, probably more than 90%. And it's available every day in hospitals, but it has a half-life of 6 hours. It decays away at such a rate that half of it is gone every 6 hours. So how is it possible to have a radionuclide that is manufactured in Canada or in South Africa or in Russia, and yet every hospital in the UK has a supply of it? How is it possible to transport it? Well, we don't transport it is the answer. What we do is transport another isotope, which has a much longer half-life, which decays to technetium-99m. So this solves the problem, and this is how it works. In the reactor, in the nuclear reactor, we produce the longer-lived isotope, which is molybdenum-99. Molybdenum-99 has a half-life of 60 hours, as opposed to 6 hours. And molybdenum-99 is radioactive, and it decays to technetium-99 by emission of a beta particle. But molybdenum-99 in the form of molybdate has a 2- charge, and it can be bound to a solid phase, which is actually alumina, just aluminium oxide. And it binds very strongly to the solid phase, but as it decays to technetium, some of that molybdenum gets turned into technetium, and the technetium is not bound to the column, to the solid phase, anywhere near as strongly as the molybdenum, and you can wash it off with just washing it with saline. So you wash it with saline, the saline washes it through into a vial, and you now have a sample of your technetium-99m, which you can use to make your radio tracers. Really simple. Now, the real joy of it is that then you can come back a few hours later, and more of the molybdenum will have decayed to technetium, so the next day or a few hours later you can then elute it with saline again and have another batch of technetium-99m. So you can have a batch of it every day or twice a day for a week or two, and then you have to get a new one. Now all this just makes it possible for this very short half-life radio tracers to be delivered all around the world and be routinely available in hospitals in most towns. We then have to take this technetium, or whatever the radio label is, and convert it into the actual radio tracers that are going to be injected into the patients. And there are many different tracers for different purposes, for different diseases. And because of the short half-life, it has to be done on the hospital premises. So it has to be very quick. This piece of synthetic chemistry that has to be done in the hospital has to be very fast, very simple. It's got to be done according to good manufacturing practice, which means it's got to be according to a rigid protocol. It's got to be completely reliable. It's got to be sterile and pure and pyrogen-free. It's got to be fit to inject into a patient. And it's got to be done in a way that avoids the staff who do it getting a big radiation dose. So actually quite complicated chemistry has to be done in a very simple set of short manipulations. It has to be very simple. The other role of it, so the role of the chemist is to enable this complicated chemistry to be done in a very simple way. Also at the cutting edge to identify new diseases and new targets that can benefit from this kind of molecular imaging. And many of those new applications involve fragile biological molecules like proteins, which have to be handled and radio-labeled under very carefully controlled conditions in order to stop them getting damaged. So we can do this, and the simplicity of doing the process in the hospital belies the complexity of what's happening in the actual vial. And the way we do it is to add the pertechnetate from the generator into a vial that contains all the ingredients to convert it into a range of different tracers for bone imaging, for heart imaging, for kidney imaging, and so on. And the manipulation is so simple that we just take a syringe, put some pertechnetate, technetium-99m in the syringe, inject it into a vial that contains all these ingredients, and that's it, it's done. And then you can just inject it into the patient. You can see a technician doing it here. He's got the vial with the ingredients in it inside this lead shield, and he's got his syringe with technetium-99m in it, also in a lead shield, and all he's doing is squirting that technetium into the vial, and that's as simple as that, it's all done. All the complexity is happening inside that vial. Some of the chemistry cannot be reduced to such simplicity, and it has to be done in a complicated series of chemical steps. And to avoid the operator getting a radiation dose, and actually to speed it up sufficiently to be able to do it in the time available, and some of the tracers have a very short half-life, We have a robotic synthesizer which does it automatically and does all the manipulations. That avoids the staff getting a radiation dose. And this whole thing is placed inside a great big lead box to shield the operator from the radioactivity inside it, and also to protect it from bacterial contamination from the environment. So some hospitals have this kind of more complex kit and can do more complicated chemistry. I think it's, I can just whiz through a couple of examples from my nuclear chocolate box here, a very restricted set of examples, and I'm going to start at group 1 of the periodic table. And group 1 of the periodic table is actually really boring. The metals in group 1 don't do anything except float around in water, being surrounded by water molecules, but there is a useful radioisotope in group 1, rubidium-82. And rubidium-82 is valuable because although it has a half-life of only 75 seconds, as far as your body is concerned, your body thinks it's potassium. And many organs in your body have another pump in the cell membrane, especially in the heart, which pumps potassium into cells. And of course, if they can't tell the difference between potassium and rubidium, they will pump rubidium into the cells. And because this happens particularly in the heart, you can use it to image the muscle of the heart. So these are PET images of a cross-section through the heart. This is a cross-section, and you can see some of the regions of the heart muscle are not quite as brightly lit up as others. And this is telling you that there is a defect in the blood supply to the heart. And we've recently discovered that actually this can apply to tumours as well. So we can transfer this application of heart scanning with rubidium to imaging cancer. This is a patient with colon cancer. Now, I mentioned that it has a half-life of 75 seconds. How do we deal with that? Well, it's nice that we don't have to do any chemistry, because rubidium essentially doesn't have any chemistry, but the trick here is that instead of taking the stuff out of a vial and putting it with a syringe and injecting it into the patient, we actually have a generator, just like the technetium generator, and we plumb this directly into the patient. So the saline washes it through from the generator, through a tube, straight into the patient's vein. So there's no handling of the radioactivity. It just goes straight into the patient. And then the scan is done within a minute or two. The radioactivity is all gone in 5 minutes, so the patient gets a very low radiation dose. So that's a really simple process for a hospital to do. Group 14, of course, contains carbon, and carbon is the basis for nearly every biological molecule that you can imagine. So carbon-11, which is a positron emitter, is a fantastically versatile radionuclide. Trouble is, it's got a very short half-life of 20 minutes, so you don't get much time to do the chemistry to make it into all these different molecules. And it always is a complicated process, and it always requires that kind of robotic synthesizer type approach that I showed a couple of slides ago. But fantastically versatile. And here's a couple of examples. You can have a carbon-11 labeled version of glucose, and this is a compound for imaging the amyloid deposition in Alzheimer's disease. So this is a patient with Alzheimer's disease, a section through their brain, and this is a normal person of the same age. So you can see that you've got the potential to diagnose some of the molecular features of Alzheimer's disease. Here are some more organic molecules labeled with fluorine-18. I showed you glucose earlier on, showed you what those scans look like. Lots of other organic molecules and drug-like molecules can be labeled with fluorine-18. In group 17 also has iodine in it, and iodine is really important because of being able to treat thyroid cancer and image thyroid disease with it. And again, you can incorporate iodine into organic molecules and radiolabeled proteins with it. So iodine isotopes are very versatile as well. So I showed you these images before. We're imaging thyroid cancer in this case. We can use fluorine without incorporating it into any complicated molecules. This is just fluorine-18 in the form of fluoride, and fluoride has an affinity for bone and teeth, of course. And this is a patient with prostate cancer whose disease is gradually spreading to the bone, and over a period of time you can see the disease getting more and more prevalent all around the skeleton, and it's being shown up because fluoride is being taken up in the sites where there is bone disease. Even the noble gases, which don't do anything chemically at all. This is in group 18. This is an image of distribution of the gas in the lung done with krypton 81M, which has a half-life of 13 seconds. Again, there's no chemistry to do, so that's not too difficult. And again, this is a generator-produced isotope, and again, there isn't time to actually take the radioisotope and give it to the patient. The patient breathes it directly from the generator. So you just hook up the patient to the generator, they take a few breaths, and you do the image, and the radioactivity is gone. So again, it's a very low radiation dose application. I just want to mention technetium. I don't want to go into any more chemistry of technetium, but technetium has been hugely important, and until the fluorodeoxyglucose came along, it was the basis of almost all gamma camera imaging. But recently, the handful of nuclear reactors that produce the molybdenum-99 from which we get technetium, a lot of them broke down or had to be maintained at the same time, and there was some downtime, and that led to worldwide shortages of technetium. So there's a bit of a debate going on now in the community, and you may have read about it in the papers because you only ever hear about science when something goes wrong. Do we build new reactors to make sure that the technetium supply continues? Do we abandon technetium? Is it outdated technology and replace it with something else? This is something that the guys in nuclear medicine are talking about. Some companies are investing in building new reactors. Some companies are investing in new technology to replace it. So it'll be interesting to see over the next few years where that goes. One last question, which is, I guess, where we started. Is it safe? Is it safe? Some of you may recognize this iconic image from the film Marathon Man, which kept me away from the dentist for about 10 years after I saw it. That was his question. Is it safe? Well, radiation is all around us. It's part of the natural world. The average, radiation doses to people, which are used to assess risk, are measured in a unit called sieverts. And a typical person gets a background dose from the environment and from radioactivity within your own body of about 2 to 2.5 millisieverts per year. Just from the normal environment. A PET scan would give you about 3 times that, 7 millisieverts. And bear in mind that a person would have a PET scan once or twice in their life, possibly. CT scans, X-rays, give a similar type of radiation dose. The lowest level of radiation dose that we can actually detect a slightly increased risk of cancer is about 100 millisieverts a year, so about 10 to 20 PET scans. It really becomes measurable if you go to 1,000 millisieverts a year, 5% risk of fatal cancer, and if you get 10,000 millisieverts all in one go, you'll die very quickly. So on that scale, 7 millisieverts is not a big deal, and of course bear in mind what would be the risk of not doing the scan. We wouldn't know enough about the patient's disease. We would make incorrect patient management decisions. So in the clinical situation, obviously that's a risk worth taking. And in terms of, you can measure it in terms of effects on life expectancy as well. A PET scan, average effect on life expectancy of about 1.5 days compared to perhaps many, many years extended life if you make the correct medical decision. Exposure, cigarette smoking, 2,250 days on average is the shortening of your life caused by smoking cigarettes. So that just puts that risk in perspective. But there is bad news, of course. Radioactivity is poisonous. It is toxic, and you will have seen this image in the media a few years ago when this gentleman was assassinated by giving him polonium-210, which is an alpha emitter. This is the image which is the most famous, seeing him in his hospital bed dying of radiation sickness. That's what he looked like before. So nasty stuff, but we don't give people radioisotopes with a half-life of 138 days. So this is a summary. I'm way over time, I do apologise to Sam. Where things are going now, there's a move away from gamma camera imaging towards PET imaging. There's a move towards combining radionuclide imaging with other kinds of imaging modalities in order to take advantage of the different kinds. I showed you a picture of a combined PET and MR scanner earlier on. And moving towards more use of radionuclides for therapy to treat cancer especially. And I've drawn the analogy with a chocolate box because it's everyone has got a different center, and it's fun for me to choose and do chemistry right across the periodic table. So it's great fun as a chemist. And the message, which I hope you'll take away from Sam's bit as well, is that radioactivity is not all bad, like chocolate. So I will stop there. I'll just finish with just reminding you again that this is a multidisciplinary exercise. Chemists are just one of the team. We have biologists and radiochemists and cell biologists and physics, imaging physicists and computer specialists, and of course the medics who actually look after the patients. So I will stop there. I'll get Sam to take over. Sam Terry is a postdoctoral fellow working in our lab, and she's a biologist. So another multidisciplinary element in the team.
First slide, a bit of a disclaimer. I'm a biologist, not a chemist, not a physicist, not anything else, biologist. And I started working in Phil's group about a year ago. But I have actually been in the field of radiation biology since my PhD. I looked to see how radiation damaged cells, what are the mechanisms behind it, what proteins are involved, and can we exploit these mechanisms. And I then moved on to work in radionuclide therapy a little bit and imaging, but all as from a biologist's perspective. And when most people think about radiation therapy, especially when used in the clinic, they think of this kind of a system. They think of a linear accelerator where the electrons are produced, they are accelerated, they hit a target like tungsten, and ultimately you get the production of X-rays that produces this therapeutic efficacy. And what happens is that even in external beam irradiation, which is what this represents, you get an awful lot of evolution happening. So there's a lot happened in the field of external beam irradiation, and this is one of the latest forms of external beam irradiation. It's where we use images to produce a different dose to different areas within the body. So on this slide here, in panel A, we just have a CT scan of a patient. You can't really tell where the tumor is in this particular patient. In the second, in number B, letter B, we have an FDG scan. So this is our radio-labeled glucose that's been injected. And what happens is that this obviously gets taken up, as Phil said, in the tumor quite a lot. And now we can quite clearly see the more yellow areas, the brighter areas, are the areas where there's an awful lot of glucose present. And as such, because we now know where the tumor is, we can then modify how we give the radiation to this particular patient. What we can now do is make sure that we're giving the highest possible dose in the tumor area whilst minimizing as much as possible the dose to all the healthy areas around the tumor. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this image here. This is a concept called dose painting. It's almost like painting by numbers, but for medical physicists. As you can see, they've basically given, well, it's maybe not very clear, but they have given the highest dose to the very center of the tumor. And this is done in quite an easy way because radiation is given in a 360-degree angle. So if your tumor is smack in the middle and you're basically irradiating it for 7 different angles, you will get the highest dose in the middle and a little bit of dose in the surrounding areas. I say a little bit of dose. I think any dose of radiation to healthy tissues should be avoided if possible. And obviously, radionuclide therapy, I hope you'll see by the end of this talk, can help quite a lot with that. So radionuclide therapy, Phil's given an excellent introduction into the use of radionuclides in general, including in therapy. And he mentioned that the very first one to be used clinically for therapeutic reasons is p32 phosphate for leukemias. You also have many beta-emitting radionuclides, such as yttrium-90 and iodine-131, lutetium-177, which can be attached to antibodies, which when you inject them, they circulate through the body until they hit the tumor. The rest of it clears through the bloodstream into either the gut or the kidneys, and we excrete it, leaving just the highlighted tumor, which you would see in imaging, but in this particular case you're giving a therapeutic dose of the radionuclide. And these are used for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is the big one. And also neuroblastoma, if MIBG is another molecule, if that's radio-labeled with iodine-131, you get the same thing. This image on the left, yes, left, is a patient with prostate cancer who has been injected, who has been imaged with a radioactive PSMA. PSMA stands for prostate-specific membrane antigen, which, as you can imagine, would highlight any prostate cancer cells that are present. And well, you can clearly see that there is a difference between A and B. So in A, the patient had been treated and the prostate cells had metastasized throughout the body quite heavily. You can see an awful lot of dark images in A. And this number, and not only the number, but also the intensity of the uptake of these radiotraces has decreased quite significantly after treatment with a lutetium-labeled PSMA conjugate instead. So this is an example where radionuclide therapy does seem to be working, and we always need the imaging side to confirm whether it's worked or not. That's a method of targeted therapy. I don't really need to go into very much detail on the way in which iodine-131 gets localized to tumors. So you often have thyroid cells, and whether they're thyroid cells in general already have this transporter called the sodium iodide importer. This imports sodium as well as iodide. It's quite self-explanatory, and it's required, as Phil said, in the synthesis of thyroid hormone, which is used in a whole plethora of functions in the body. Now, overactive thyroid cells, as well as tumor cells of the thyroid, they tend to overexpress this importer, and so you get more and more uptake of the iodine, and that's exactly what we obviously exploit with the use of radioactive iodine-131. And this here is an image. Can you see? I didn't know the setup of the room, I'm sorry. So here we can see that iodine-131 is a beta emitter, but is also a low gamma emitter, so we can image where it goes in the body. And you can see in the circle exactly where the isotope has gone, and in this case it's gone in the thyroid in the circle, as well as the salivary glands, the gut and the kidneys, and the bladder is what you can see in this case, and that's simply because of the excretion routes, but also because other areas in the body also express this importer. So it's always something to keep in the back of your mind when you're using radionuclides for therapy, that you're not always just targeting tumor cells, but also some healthy ones as well. On to radium. This is a very exciting isotope. It was first discovered by the Curies in 1898. They won the Nobel Prize. In 1910, surprisingly, the US started synthesizing it and putting it into chocolate. So we're back to chocolate, apparently. If you were feeling unwell, you could just have a tiny bite of it and somehow it would magically make you better. I don't quite understand their reasoning. They also used to put it in face creams, and again, same thing, if you had a slight wart or some kind of weird acne, again, this would magically get rid of it, and they also used it in toothpaste and other things as well. What's really interesting is that even now people are actually finding radium in their back gardens. In fact, member of my family recently inherited a house and doesn't quite know what to do with their radium, so I'm investigating every single avenue, but it seems to be quite expensive to get rid of. So you can see this quite scary looking woman at the bottom here. So she's a woman that's advertising radium cream, and if I were to look at this, I wouldn't necessarily buy it. But you can see that she's glowing in quite an eerie way, and that's actually one of the things that happens when people put radium into stuff. If it's in with zinc sulfides, for instance, the alpha particles emitted by the radium will ultimately lead to this kind of magic glow. And it's this glow that was used when people were creating watches. They wanted to obviously get this nice glow in their dials so they could tell the time when it's quite late and dark. And so what they would have is they would have the radium in this paint, so you could paint it on, and they had many women in factories whose role it was to actually paint those dials. And what they would do, which is rather unfortunate, is to get the absolute perfect job, they would lick the tip of their brush and actually ingest the radium. And this led to some quite nasty diseases. Radium acts very much like calcium, and it goes to the bone, and of course a lot of people had issues with their teeth, they had issues with their jaws, they had weird growths in the head and neck, and it was rather an unfortunate event. But the use of radium-223 is, so that was back then. It has recently been used, and in a clinical trial, in quite an exciting clinical trial, and one that will actually change the field of radionuclide therapy in medicine at the minute, I think. Radium-223 was used in a phase 3 clinical trial where patients with prostate cancer which had metastasized and where the patients were resistant to any other treatment, so this was sort of their last hope, where they were split into two cohorts. So we had one cohort which was the placebo group, and the other got the radium-223. And this is basically the key result in their study. We're looking at overall survival of these patients, of these two cohorts, and the patients who received radium-223 survived on average 4 months longer than the ones who did not. And although this might not seem like quite a long time, in actual fact this is a huge enhancement of their life, and in fact it was such a huge deal that the study was halted early on so that all the placebo group could be put onto radium-223 group. And with this was just a few years ago. In fact, this paper was published in 2013. And with this, it's kind of reinvigorated people with looking at different kind of radionuclides. Until now, a lot of beta particle emitting radionuclides were used, and obviously alpha particles could also play a role. But what next is the question, I guess. And this is where I think radiation biology could really help. This field of biology is often ignored, but I hope to reinvigorate that too. And it is basically looking at how radiation kills cells. What are the mechanisms behind it, and how can we exploit these mechanisms to make better and safer, so better radiopharmaceuticals in terms of therapy, also radiopharmaceuticals that are safer to the rest of our body. So basically, how can we target them better to tumors and other such things. And the very key thing in radiation biology is the DNA. The target for both external beam irradiation and radionuclide therapy is ultimately the DNA. And the reason why it's key is because it acts as a language. DNA is made up of 4 bases. You have your A, T, Gs, and Cs, although why they didn't go with A, B, C, Ds, I don't know. And these 4 bases are the equivalent of our 3 Morse code symbols. The Morse code symbols translate very easily into letters. We know that this then makes words, they then make paragraphs, books, meaning to stuff, and it's the same with DNA. DNA you have these 4 bases. These are also translated. These are translated into amino acids, which gets made into proteins, which then makes everything that's in our body, basically. Everything in our single cell is made up of these things, and without them we couldn't function. Now, if you imagine, I hope my analogy works well. If you imagine your DNA to be a piece of string, and you have your radiation, and your radiation is a pair of scissors, if you cut that radiation right at the end of my piece of string, you're going to lose this tiny bit of information at the end. You're going to lose this bit of string. And that might not seem very detrimental, but if you change anything in the sequence of a DNA, actually it does change your amino acids, it then changes the protein it makes, it then changes everything within that cell. Now, it's kind of the same as in words, I guess. If you were to change one single letter in a word, you change the whole meaning of it. It's the same in DNA. Crying and trying are 2 very different things. Also, if you wanted to go see the film Snakes in a Plane, and instead the K was replaced by a P magically because you cut that bit of string, Snakes on a Plane would be rather disappointing. Now, the DNA isn't one nice long piece of string. In fact, the DNA, in one single cell, our DNA is about 2 meters tall, and I'm 170, so it's taller than I am in one cell. So how does the DNA fit into a cell? Well, obviously, just like string, it coils up. So you keep coiling and coiling and coiling until eventually it's so dense that it will fit into a cell. It's the same thing. If you were now again to attack that DNA that has now been condensed with radiation, you wouldn't just lose one end of a string of DNA, you would lose a whole chunk of it. And that's exactly what I was looking at during my PhD. I was looking at these things called chromatid breaks. I had to count how many hundreds of these there were per cell. It was very exciting. But you can see in every single one of these boxes, there's this white bit, there's this bit that's missing. What is that bit? Where has it gone? Have we lost all of that information, or is it just condensed into the rest of the chromosome? We don't actually know. What we do know is that these gaps can be up to 1/3 of a chromatid in size, which is huge. This is up to 40 million base pairs, and that's quite a large number, but if you were to put it into a Y chromosome is about 60 million base pairs, so you've lost the majority, or you think you've lost the majority of all that information, which can have disastrous consequences for the cell. There are 3 possible responses to radiation. The very first one is that absolutely nothing happens. Right now I've been talking for I think about 10 minutes, and we've had thousands and thousands of hits on our DNA in every single one of our cells, and they've all been repaired. We'll all walk out here without a problem, at least I hope so. DNA repair mechanisms are fabulous. The second thing that could happen is that we could increase our risk of cancer. So with every single possible mutation that happens through the radiation, you can have lots of chromosomes fused together, and if that escapes the cell's security system, I guess, then that could have detrimental effects. And if you, for instance, stay out in the sun too much without sunblock, every single mutation could increase your chance of cancer later on. The final thing, which is, I guess, was what we're exploiting with radionuclide therapy and external beam radiation, is lethality. So the whole point of a cell is to pass on its genetic information. That's really all it wants to do. And it wants to do it as perfectly as possible. So the cell cycle is very simple. You have a gap where it does nothing, then you have a phase where the DNA gets replicated and duplicated. So you have 2 copies of it, then again another gap where not much happens, and then you have mitosis, which is this here. And you can see the very final stage of mitosis is where that genetic information is split into 2 daughter cells. So the next step after this is that these 2 cells are not linked. And again, they'll go through their own cycle of passing on this genetic information. Now, what's really interesting about these cells is that after radiation, what happens is that if a cell detects damage to its DNA early on in the cell cycle, it's probably fine, it will probably repair it. But if you irradiate it right before mitosis happens, when it basically escapes the security systems, the cell goes into self-destruct mode if it then realizes it right at the last minute. So one example, so that there are many examples of chromosomal changes after radiation close to mitosis. This is one of them. So that's our normal beautiful X-shaped chromosome on the left, and here we have a cell at the final stage of mitosis with an anaphase bridge. Anaphase is just the phase of mitosis. But you can see that there's quite clearly a bridge between linking the 2 to-be daughter chromosomes. You can imagine if a cell did actually divide, then that would be torn, and you wouldn't be able to say for sure that every single daughter cell would have exactly the same genetic information, and that it would be intact, and that it would create the kind of cell that you would want to perpetuate, etc. So instead, the cell then goes into self-destruct mode. It goes into apoptosis and various other mechanisms, and ultimately your cell dies, and that's how we use radiation in our tumor cells. But of course, our normal cells also have this mechanism. Everything in radiation biology depends on this term LET, linear energy transfer, and it's something that Phil already alluded to. It is basically the amount of energy that's deposited over a certain distance. So our beta particles are medium energy, quite high energy. They actually deposit that energy not in a linear fashion across this distance, but say it was homogeneous across a distance of about 1 centimeter. And this would work really well if we had a tumor with a diameter of 2 centimeters and our beta particle was in the middle. What would happen, obviously, is that our beta particles in the middle, it would irradiate out 1 centimeter anyway, and your tumor would go into self-destruct mode, I guess. If that tumor was slightly smaller, then what would happen is not only are you irradiating the tumor itself, but also all the cells around it, and these are your healthy cells, and that's what we would like to try and avoid, which is why alpha particles are really exciting. Alpha particles are high LET, is how we classify them. They have a really high energy in the mega electron volts range in the higher mega electron volt range rather than the lower. And this time around, they're depositing all of that energy not across 1 centimeter, but actually across 50 microns. And 50 microns, this is an average, it depends on the radionuclides, but 50 microns is about 5 cell diameters worth. So this time around, you can actually you can actually make sure that if you had a smaller tumour, you would want to use an alpha particle. If that alpha particle were to sit in the middle, it would irradiate just that small tumour and none of the healthy tissue. But of course, if you've got a massive tumour, massive for radionuclides, then you would need multiple of these alpha particles to be deposited across the tumour. It's just something to think about in the design of radionuclide therapy. And the final thing is Auger electrons. These aren't currently used in the clinic so much. Well, they are and they aren't. They're not used for therapeutic purposes. So Auger electrons have often been ignored because they have a really low energy. But actually they're really important because they have a really high LET. They deposit all of that low energy in a tiny amount of space. And this is what makes them so potentially dangerous, which is good in radionuclide therapy. I want to kind of mix my metaphors a bit. So I would like to basically describe the alphas, betas, and Auger electron emitting radionuclides as the ability for you to swing a cat in a china shop. Our beta particles are sort of our really big fat cats that are almost like mini ponies. If you were to take it by its tail and whiz it round a china shop, you would probably damage everything in that china shop quite equally. Maybe not even that shop, but also the shop across the road. I'm sorry for any cat-loving people out there. Alpha particles, however, are normal-sized cats. This time around, if you were to swing them, they would still cause an awful lot of damage, but only in their small surrounding. And the very final one are our Auger electrons, where we take a kitten. I don't suggest you do this at home, and you swing it around, and it causes you get the point, I guess. So localization becomes really important when thinking about radionuclide therapy and how big a tumor is, but not because obviously if your tumor is really big, you might need multiple alpha particles or a million Auger electron emitting radionuclides in one tumor. But what's also really important is the subcellular localization, which is something that I'm now going to be looking into, I hope. So the subcellular localization becomes really important, especially for the Auger electrons. These Auger electrons here, if they were to be localized on the outside of the cell, and your nucleus happens to be really close, you could probably get enough radiation damage to the DNA within that nucleus to cause that cell to die. However, if your nucleus was on the other side, then your energy probably wouldn't penetrate far enough and nothing would happen. So with the alpha particles, this isn't such an issue. With the alpha particles, what's more of an issue is the fact that you want to limit the toxicity to healthy tissues, which is even more of an issue for the beta particles, where the energy is obviously deposited in such a larger range. So all I want you to take home from this is don't swing cats at home. Choosing the right radionuclide for the right tumour is incredibly important, and also choosing the right thing to attach your radionuclide to target that tumour also becomes really important when you want to actually localise it either within the nucleus, the cytoplasm, or the outside of the cell. That leads me to, I guess we're on the question round. These are some questions I've been asked by school kids. Do I like llamas? The answer is no, so you already know that one, you don't have to ask it. If you have any other questions, Phil and I will be happy to answer them. Thank you. Hi. Oh, we have mics, I forgot to say.
Thank you. You talked earlier about the use of technetium-99 as a radionucleotide that you attach to drug molecules, and that it's very, very useful. Hospitals use it extensively every day, I think you said.
Yep.
Could you give us some idea of what the cost of these drugs are to the average hospital?
Wow. I can say a typical PET scan will cost about £1,000.
Just the cost of the drug itself, not...
The drug itself would cost a few hundred, yeah. So the PET scan, including the production of the tracer, which is on the premises, and the scanning time using the scanner between £1,000 and £1,500 per scan, per patient.
Okay.
So it's a lot of money, but the information that you get from that scan may save a patient having surgery, which would cost a huge amount more.
And usually a patient would only need one scan.
Usually, sometimes they get multiple scans to see how the progress of their treatment is going. Often that's part of a research study, but yeah, usually as part of a routine treatment they would get one, maybe 2 scans at the most.
Can I ask a second question?
Yes, in the absence of a chairman, yeah, do what you like.
You mentioned the uptake of iodine by the thyroid gland. I seem to remember in cases of nuclear disasters where radiation has been emitted by power stations that the local populations are given iodine tablets. Now, are these actually iodide tablets, and are they given the iodide tablet to swamp the thyroid with healthy iodide ions so that you've got a very low chance of actually taking in a radioactive iodide ion?
Yeah, they can be given non-radioactive iodide in relatively large doses, so it swamps the effect. It swamps the transporter, so the transporter's so busy transporting the non-radioactive iodide that it doesn't get to take up much of the radioactive iodide. It's not always iodine tablets. You can give other drugs that, I mean, you can overload somebody with iodine and they can, and cause thyroid disease. So you can have other inhibitors of that process, which are not iodine, which just block it but don't actually create more thyroid hormones.
But the actual medicine is sodium iodide.
It would be sodium.
Salt.
It would be sodium iodide, but it doesn't really matter because your body is very good at extracting iodine from other compounds.
Okay.
What's really interesting is in research we often use radiolabeled iodine for imaging purposes, and if we don't want to target the thyroid, we give them cold iodine to start with, so you're blocking that uptake so it can circulate through the body and actually get to where you want to.
When you say cold iodine, do you just mean iodide?
Sorry,
ions?
yes.
That's radiochemistry laboratory slang for not radioactive.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can you explain why technetium, which is not an ion normally associated with human biochemistry, has become the universal ion that so many radio-labeled processes seems to attach? Like, say for example, you might label a drug with technetium. Why technetium?
Shall I take this one?
Yeah.
Because nothing to do with its biology. It doesn't have any biology. So all of the biological processes that it gets involved with are because it's attached to some molecule, some biological molecule, which the chemist does. The reason technetium is so important is because of that generator that I talked about. The fact that you can have this little device on the premises, and you can milk it every day and have it available. If it wasn't a generator-produced isotope, you would have to either use a very long half-life radionuclide so that you could transport it from where it's manufactured. If it's got a long half-life, it means the patient will get a high radiation dose, because they will be getting a radiation dose long after the imaging is finished. So it's got a short half-life. The energy that it emits in its gamma rays are just right for the gamma camera. It's available daily, it's very cheap, and it gives very nice images without giving the patient a high radiation dose. The half-life is just long enough to be able to do the chemistry, it's long enough to do the chemistry, but not so long that the patient gets a lot of radiation dose. So it is kind of the Goldilocks radionuclide.
But there's not much new technetium
No, it's interesting.
imaging being
No, there isn't
researched.
much. I think there may be a resurgence of new interest in technetium because we have been going to such a lot of investment and trouble in the last 3 or 4 years to recover from this shortage that we've been suffering, and to build new reactors and to make new ways of making technetium that I think the community has realised just how important technetium has been, and that now we're so attached to it. There will be some renewed efforts to build technetium into new molecules. I think there'll be a reinvigoration of interest in that old chemistry.
But why does it stick to everything?
No, that's my job as the chemist to stop that happening. So I will my job is to incorporate the technetium into a molecule using smart chemistry that can let maybe a protein which will bind specifically to the tumour, and if it doesn't stick to the tumour, it will be excreted. That's the job of the interaction between the chemist and the biologist to make that happen. Oh.
Just a different question on the therapeutic side. You talked a bit about the use of the critical moment at which just before mitosis was happening. But I'm just interested in what determines whether the treatment works or not. Is it very much to do with whether you get the right dose in the right position, or is it in some cases the apoptosis just doesn't happen because the cell is sort of too far gone for that, or there's some biological reason behind it?
That is a good question. The answer, there are so many answers. It's not just how much dose a cell is given, it's what type of dose rate you had. So even if you were to give, for instance, 20 gray, it's a very low dose, you wouldn't give that to a patient, but say you were to give 20 gray to a cell, if you gave that in 1 second versus a year, that would completely change how a cell recovers. Also, the sensitivity of the cell in the first place matters quite a lot. So for instance, we have quite a lot of sensitive tissues in our system. So the bone marrow is one of them. They're constantly replenishing. The gut's another. Obviously, the reproductive organs are quite sensitive. Not so much sensitive, maybe dose limiting. Then what else is there? There's the repair state of the cell initially. So some tumor cells, we have lots of repair pathways, but two main ones. And if one of them is down in a tumor cell, which could happen because a tumor cell basically wants its genome to be unstable, so it could keep mutating and keep growing. If that's the case and you hit that tumor cell, you will probably damage it so much that that the one remaining repair pathway can't actually fix it. However, in our normal healthy tissues, we still have those two repair pathways intact, and what would happen then is that although you might have knocked down one repair pathway by causing this damage, you could still have the other one recoup. I forgot the rest of your question, I'm sorry. There's so much to talk about. Have tea.
Is there any work being done on the use of monoclonal antibodies in radiotherapy?
Oh yes, monoclonal antibodies are the kind of designer targeting molecule. You can create monoclonal antibodies to bind to all kinds of different targets, and the chemistry for attaching radioisotopes to monoclonal antibodies is very well established. It's developing and improving all the time. We have modified versions of monoclonal antibodies. I showed you one problem with a monoclonal antibody which takes so much time to clear, and so we're developing smaller versions that will clear more quickly, so we can still get the targeting and still get the binding to the target, but get rid of the radioisotope and get it excreted quickly, so that we can use a shorter half-life tracer.
Not only that, but you can also engineer these antibodies to have two targets just on the one antibody. So, for instance, if you had an example, I guess iodine 131. There are different symporters elsewhere in the body. If you wanted to make it more specific, if there was another target that was overexpressed on thyroid cancer, then you would hopefully make it bind more to the thyroid cells than to the other cells that also had this symporter. It's not a very good example, in fact, thinking back. There's a lot of work.
Quite a big fraction of research on targeted radionuclide therapy involves antibodies. Yeah.
There's one at the front and one at the back. Just here, third row. Lady.
I've read recently that all the animal population at Chernobyl far from suffering huge damage to their DNA from the nuclear explosions. And in fact, there was very little damage appeared to have occurred within the animal populations. Does this mean that more research needs to be done on just what the effects of radiation is on healthy cells if it hasn't affected things like foxes, rabbits, or whatever?
So you mean, do you mean whether the animal models are actually a good model to even be using for the effects on radiation in humans?
Yes, whether in fact there must be some reason which could be useful from a medical point of view, and the fact that they don't suffer permanent damage.
That's a really interesting one, because you would actually think it'd be the other way around, because a lot of the animals that we use are usually immunodeficient, or there's something wrong with them in their repair pathways.
The biological, environmental damage and the human damage, disease in children, thyroid disease and so on, turned out to be a lot less than what was expected after Chernobyl. Nearly all the radiobiological predictions about how people will respond to radiation doses like that were based, it's terrible to say it, but were based on survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were given a very short-term high dose of radiation, which is a very different way. I mean, as you were saying earlier on, the dose rate was completely different. So we were making these predictions on the basis of what we learned about a completely different scenario. Now it turns out that this more prolonged radiation exposure at a lower level is not as toxic and dangerous as would be predicted on that basis. So we're still learning about what are the risks. It's a very difficult area to investigate, because you have to study huge populations, and really don't know what radiation doses they're receiving. It's an extremely sort of tenuous thing to investigate. But I think the summary is that there was a lot less disease and environmental damage because of the radiation leaks from Chernobyl than was expected.
It would be interesting in a few decades' time to see what the Fukushima accident will bring, which is a really terrible thing to say, I know. But also what's really interesting is, yes, we do know a lot more about the lower doses of radiation and their effects, but actually there's still a black hole in the really low doses of radiation. We don't know what it does. So we kind of have an idea that with dose, the effects kind of go like that. But there's a box here at the center where we don't know if it goes like this, or if it goes like that, or if it's just a linear thing, and that's something that we just can't tweeze out unless we have really large population samples.
There is some evidence that a prolonged very low dose to radiation actually gives you some level of protection from later higher doses. Yeah. It's very nebulous. It's very difficult to say whether that's true or not, but it's out there under discussion, under investigation.
That would make radiation good for you, I guess, if that was the case.
In the same way that, getting dirty helps your immune system kind of thing.
Can I ask a question? Would many of these new PET tracers be commercially viable or licensable, or is there another way that you can get them onto the market?
Yeah, the answer is some of them are. FDG isn't patented by anybody. It's so difficult to make and distribute that companies who do it are pretty well protected, because it's a very difficult market to break into. But yes, people do make money out of patenting their intellectual property and marketing new PET tracers, yeah. Maybe even me one day.
Me again, I'm afraid. I know that work's being done to develop new antibacterial drugs that are designed not to kill bacterial cells, but to slow down their metabolic rate to make them less of a threat. Is some of the work being done in developing new radioactive drugs that can slow down the metabolic rate of cancerous cells and therefore slow down their reproduction rate?
Almost no. I wrote a grant once to do that very thing some years ago. Grants get refereed by peers who and it was completely slaughtered. They thought I was completely round the bend. There is evidence now that you can treat certainly 1 or 2 fungal infections with radioactivity, targeted by delivering targeted radiotherapy towards that will bind specifically to the fungal cells in the body. Things like Aspergillus infection. It's right on the cutting edge. And probably most of the scientific community think the people who are doing it are bonkers. But I think it's extremely interesting.
The thought being that nature has a great way of developing protection against death.
Yeah.
Cells don't want to die, so they'll, change so that they stay alive. But they don't mind being put to sleep.
Yeah.
They're still alive.
Don't know. But to investigate that, you have to convince your peers that it's something that we should spend money on, and that is not easy. I think we might be done.
No, there's
no,
another
we're not. Sorry.
You mentioned that there are new designs of work on new kinds of PET and related equipment. Is a company in the UK manufacturing that? And that reminds me that as a vocation apprentice back in 1958, I was actually worked on the testing of linear accelerators and related equipment at what is the company that virtually disappeared in what was Metrovix and became AEI in Trafford Park.
Sorry, was there a question?
The question was whether anybody in the UK is working on the...
Well, the companies that do this are multinational, but the manufacturers with a UK base, GE is a big one. GE bought out about a decade ago or more Amersham International, which was probably the world leading producer of radionuclides, which was actually based at Amersham just outside London. GE took that over, but so they not only produce the radio tracers and the radionuclides, but the gamma cameras and the PET scanners as well.
Time for tea.
Time for something.